Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, if you remember, last week, hashtag Stop the Treaty was trending. People were saying countries are about to give up their sovereignty to the WHO, meaning that we wouldn't be allowed to make a decision as a nation regarding our pandemic responses in the future, so that we would instead be beholden to global laws run by unelected officials. Now, last week was the World Health Assembly, the governing body of the WHO, composed of representatives from nearly every country in the world, gathered together in Geneva, Switzerland. And for a couple of days, they discussed proposed changes to the IHR, which is the International Health Regulations, that were proposed by the U.S. and other wealthy Western nations such as the U.K., Australia, and whatnot. So just to explain a little bit more about the fear and what this IHR is. So the IHR is a set of agreed upon rules of how countries would behave during some sort of outbreak. This was actually drafted originally in 1970, and it's gone through several different phases of amendments. The most recent amendment and changes to the IHR was done in 2005. Now, pretty much every single country in the world is a part of the World Health Assembly. So every country in the world is beholden to these agreed upon rules of how countries will behave if there's some sort of public health crisis. Now, this is a legally binding document, but the document it's pretty soft in its language. So even if it is legally binding, as we saw in this pandemic with COVID-19, certain countries like China, for example, not exactly cooperating with investigations, nothing really happens to them. There's not any actual consequences. So as I discussed in a radar last week, the WHO proposed, as well as alongside some wealthy Western countries, to make some serious changes to that document to force countries to be a bit more beholden to some rules by maybe having some sort of police power that's given to the WHO. That would come in the form of sanctions or other sort of financial consequences if countries don't behave the way they're supposed to be behaving during a global pandemic or any other sort of health crisis. So a lot of people were against it, saying, hey, you can't take away a country's sovereignty. If you do this and you say you're beholden to these rules that were made by unelected officials in Geneva, Switzerland, and you're suddenly going to be beholden to this, you no longer have any control over your own population, over your own pandemic response. So it wasn't going over very well. So then the hashtag Stop the Treaty started trending all online, people saying we don't want to be beholden to what the WHO wants to do, which whoever this unelected czar is, we don't want them to decide what is going to be the right course of action in the next pandemic. Lockdowns, testing and tracing, vaccine passports, the list could go on. Now, during this World Health Assembly last week, when they were discussing this IHR and the proposed amendments that were done by the U.S., by these Western countries, by the WHO, that would have given the WHO more power and forced countries to be more beholden. The U.S. really drafted this in response to China not being very cooperative during the investigation. Things didn't go exactly as planned. It turns out, rather than having general consensus, which is pretty typical at the WHO, several countries actually voiced objections to the proposed amendments. In fact, Botswana read a statement on behalf of 47 African nations saying that they would collectively be withholding their support for the reforms. Brazil, Russia, China, India, South Africa, Iran, and Malaysia also voiced strong objections. Brazil in particular said they would actually exit the WHO altogether if these were adopted. Now remember, South Africa, they're in this position where they felt pretty demonized for spotting a variant of the virus. They were then punished for that collectively by the rest of the world. So they understand very specifically what that police power would actually look like. They were subject to it informally. And now what the WHO wants to do, as well as these Western nations, is make that a bit more formal. Now, to explain, there was no actual vote. There's been some trending messages online saying that that the treaty was actually defeated, that these countries voted against it. There actually was no vote during these sessions. These were just debates. People were voicing their concerns. Countries were voicing their concerns. But ultimately, it forced the WHO to realize there wouldn't be consensus if they did go to their informal consensus-style voting, which is how they make decisions. Now, if there is no consensus in the WHO, in the World Health Assembly, the WHA actually, if there is no consensus, then they do go to a 2/3 majority voting process. Now, with 47 African countries, as well as many of the other nations such as Russia, India, China, not going along with this, it's unclear if they would actually receive that 2/3 vote. So it's not over. The WHO decided they're going to go back to the drawing board and they're going to be revising the amendments. They have a new group who's going to be making what they're calling technical recommendations on the proposed amendments, which will be then resubmitted along with the pandemic treaty at the 77th Health Assembly meeting in 2024. So they're going to still continue on with this. This was not defeated. We will be hearing more about attempts to modify the IHR. Western countries will, of course, continue to go in there, try to modify it to their benefit by really sort of, it seems obvious that the goal of these Western countries is to target China, quite frankly. That is why they wrote up the amendments the way they did, is that they want to be able to punish China, go after China if China doesn't behave in future pandemics. Many viruses are first discovered in China, originate in China. Many of them also originate in India. It's because they have very, very large populations that are very condensed together. So it would be a way with these amendments and this new police power to the WHO to maybe go after China. Now, one thing I want to bring up that's kind of interesting is if you look at the list of countries who actually opposed these new amendments, many of them are very friendly to China. So this effort very well could have been China on the back end, going around to all of the countries that they've been very friendly with and saying, we don't want you to go along with this because we really know that this is just an attempt by Western nations to have another tool in their toolbox to come after us at some point rather than actual warfare. Right, we would sanction China and do all of these other sort of non-combat style of warfare that we do against other countries such as Iran and Venezuela. So when you look at that list, it's interesting that many of these countries opposed, that those countries are the ones who are more, who are closely aligned with China. The countries that were going along with it were the ones that are more wary of a rising China. So that is interesting to consider in all of this. But one thing that's also really interesting is the fact that so many Republicans here in the United States, and Republicans are typically the ones who are very hawkish on China, but actually here in the US, it was Republicans who, in a way, without really knowing, sided with countries such as Russia, Iran, India, China, and those 47 African nations who are very friendly with China. They, in a way, sided with those countries without realizing it because they've been proposing new legislation here in the United States that would actually override any sort of treaty that the U.S. were to agree to at the global level. So that is something that's really interesting, is that there's this now, the Republicans sort of going along with this without realizing that China's also going along with this. I'm curious, Bree and Robbie, what your take is on that, with China being so as influential as it is in all of these other nations because of the investments, the very large investments they're doing in Africa, the friendly relationship that they've been having with all of these countries that we as a nation have demonized over the course of decades. We've gone after them in a variety of ways, and that has pushed them towards China. And now it's interesting that Republicans were also very against this treaty. I mean, look, I'm against it too. I'm not a Republican, nor am I, despite what some people might say online, an activist for China or Russia or any of these. But the reasons for many people on the left in particular, screaming about this, saying this is horrible, we don't want this, we don't want to agree to this, is because they'll say, we don't want to have to give up our individual freedom to global elites. And people on the right on the right and left saying that, coming from both sides, more of an anti-establishment sentiment. So What do you make of all of this?
Well, at first there was criticism. Donald Trump did criticize the World Health Organization for being too deferential to China. For a little while, I know Pompeo did as well. It's that figure, Tedros is, I believe, his name.
Yeah.
Was accused of being too close to China. Now, more recently, he's been critical of China, and he actually criticized the Chinese zero COVID policy, and his criticism of that was censored on the Chinese social media, the chat functions. I think it's just shifting a little bit from the World Health Organization being maybe too deferential to China to now being finally a little bit opposed to them, and maybe that helps explain why some of these people are ending up on different sides of this. But yeah, I agree with you. We don't want to we don't want to be obligated to do anything, the World Health Organization, which, it's great. I think that they're criticizing the zero COVID policy right now because that policy is insane and what China is doing is insane. But they could just as easily be under the thumb of China or any other government or our government. We've done things with the pandemic. There are areas of the pandemic response where U.S. CDC policy was more insane than what the WHO was recommending.
Hoarding vaccines that were going to go bad, not distributing them to other parts of the world, et cetera. Yeah, look, the posture of this is kind of interesting because from a Western perspective, the concern is that the World Health Organization is going to force some more draconian COVID protocols on the United States than the, liberty-loving Americans are really for. But the idea that China it's going to be used to control China is interesting, given that they do have a zero COVID policy, and they are probably much more aggressive in their approach than what the World Health Organization would ultimately.
We were too en masse.
Implement.
The World Health Organization did not recommend masks for children, for school children, nearly to the same extent our own CDC did, which was incredible.
So, Robbie, you're saying we should go along with the World Health Organization and get more free?
There's one area where, the global elites were more sane than the national elites. But in general, I agree with Kim that we got to be very skeptical about binding ourselves to kind of any of these dictates for exactly the reasons you outlined.
I think it's important to also understand, or interesting, I should say, is that this battle that's going on with this treaty is actually a battle of three different sides kind of happening all at once. And we're going to see who's the most powerful and who actually wins out on this. But on one hand, you've got, China that maybe is friendly with the WHO. After all, the WHO doesn't recognize Taiwan, right? We remember the whole, when the reporter mentioned Taiwan and the guy was like, I can't hear you, gotta go, bye, and he hung up on her.
Yeah. It's ridiculous.
So there is definitely a lot of influence from China on the WHO. So China also having influence on these other nations and saying, we don't want you to go along with this. And then those other nations saying, okay, then we're not. So you've got that power kind of thing going on there. On the Western side, you have the West that, yes, China was much more aggressive in their lockdowns and whatnot. But the West, the reason why the West wants to implement these changes to the IHR is specifically so that they have the ability to sanction countries for just another reason to sanction countries, to give them another legitimate reason to sanction. So as we know, Western countries love to do that. And then the third player in all of this is, the Bill Gates angle of this, which is he is actually the person who has a bit more sway, arguably, over the WHO than anybody else. And he does want more of the China style, he's more of the China style measures and more of we got to get more vaccines out there and all this. He has his own agenda, but his agenda is a bit conflicting with, China doesn't want. So it's interesting, these three players that are in on this. So Bill Gates would actually like to see these amendments made, but for different reasons in the United States than these Western military countries. They want to use it as another war power. Bill Gates wants to use it because he has his agenda with global health, and China doesn't want it, surprisingly. So it's interesting to see how this is all going to play out. So we'll be keeping our eye on this because this is not the last of it. They're going to be continuing to talk about this for a couple of years.
Yes, we will. All right, thank you, Kim. We'll have more Rising right after this.